This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. My guest today is a Ukrainian-born journalist, currently chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. His latest book, Our Enemies Will Vanish, The Russian Invasion and Ukraine's War of Independence, has just been published by Penguin Press. Yaroslav Trofimov, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Great to be on the show.
So we are now more than 2 years into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. When you decided to write a book about it, did you think that it would be published while the hostilities were still ongoing? And how did the decision even come about?
Yeah, I think it was clear by then it was going to be a long war. And so I came up with the idea around September 2022, which is when Ukraine broke the Russian lines and launched a surprise offensive, retaking the occupied parts of Kharkiv region and the city of Kherson. And because I didn't know how long the war would last, I decided to put two bookends to it. So the book starts the day before the full-scale invasion, so on the 23rd of February, 2022, with me meeting the former president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, and him leaning towards me at the end of an interview and whispering to my ear, it's going to be tomorrow at the break of dawn. And the other bookend is the 1-year anniversary of the full-scale invasion, so it's February 24th, 2023. And there I am, in a big hall with President Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, delivering a very long, sort of 3.5-hour oration. And then kind of the words that stuck in my mind were, we have learned hard way one thing here, that they be cruel, but nobody likes losers. And so, Ukraine's job is to be a winner. And so now we are on year 3 of the war. And, Ukraine is not winning necessarily, but it's also not losing. And, whether it will be winning or losing depends in a great deal not just on Ukrainians, but also on this kind of support it will not continue to get from the U.S. and from other democracies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. But I would like to start in the beginning and say that it was more or less, actually entirely predictable, as you show in the book, the invasion. Putin had been systematically encroaching on Ukraine's territorial integrity and independence for years. In 2022, Ukraine was better prepared for a Russian invasion than ever before, as you show in the book. Was there anything that could have been done to fend off the war, or maybe take it in a different direction?
Well, I mean, obviously, arming Ukraine with Western weapons in the previous years could have deterred Putin. But I think, in the immediate month before the war began, the full-scale war began, because let's remember, the war began in 2014. We're now on the year 11 of the war.
With the invasion of the eastern provinces, the Russian-supporting eastern provinces.
Well, with the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea, and then the Russian fostered, conflict in Donbass, in which, not just Russian proxies, but also Russian tank units and intelligence services and other armed units took direct participation. And, that conflict killed 14,000 people at the time. It was not, a small war. And it kept killing people every year since. So going back to 2022, I think Putin, and not just me thinking this, it's the assessment of many Western intelligence agencies, is that he was seeing a shrinking window of opportunity. He was seeing that Ukraine society was moving further and further away from Russian influence, in part because a whole new generation had grown up since 2014, Russian television was no longer available in Ukraine, and so it wasn't. They were no longer able to shape minds with the Russian propaganda. And crucially, the European Union had lifted visa requirements for Ukrainians. So it became very natural for young people to go on a weekend, using $29.99 Ryanair tickets to Vienna or to Paris. And so Ukrainian society was becoming more and more integrated into Europe. And at the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces were becoming much more professional because though they were not giving Western weapons, they were giving Western training by the US, by the Canadians and the Brits. And so I think the calculation in Moscow was that the more Moscow waited, the stronger Ukraine would become and the harder it would become to digest. But I think they miscalculated because by the time the invasion was launched, the full-scale invasion, it was too late.
Mm-hmm. And what was Putin's endgame vision? Like, ideally, what would he have got out of an invasion of Ukraine? Sorry.
Well, I think his initial plan was to take Kiev in a lightning strike in the Blitzkrieg in a matter of days, and then install a vassal pro-Russian regime there that would then take over the whole country. And his expectation was that Ukrainian soldiers will not fight. He actually made an appeal on day 2 of the war, to Ukrainian officers saying, turn your weapons towards these criminals in the presidential palace, and you are our brothers. And so, and when the Russian armored sort of columns were streaming towards Kiev, they were carrying parade uniforms because they were clearly expecting a quick victory. That didn't happen. The Ukrainian army did not fracture. The Ukrainian army fought ferociously, and so did the society, especially in the historically Russian-speaking regions where Putin thought he could count on local support, which was not forthcoming, as it turned out.
Mm-hmm. And then there would be a pro-Russian Ukrainian state, sort of like a Belarus twin?
Well, so if you look at the history of the collapse of the Soviet Union, something that Putin had described as the biggest tragedy of the 20th century, to him it's worse than the Holocaust. And so there were two options. One was Belarus, which renounced its sort of pro-Western orientation pretty quickly with the election of President Lukashenko. And quite clearly became a Russian proxy state, over time, and allowed itself to be used for the invasion. Putin tried the same in Ukraine with President Yanukovych, who was trying to move in that direction. Though he was elected on a platform of seeking membership in the EU, in the European Union, at a summit in Vilnius with the European Union, where he was supposed to sign an association agreement with the European Union in 2013, Yanukovych suddenly reversed course and walked away and announced he'll seek integration with Russia instead. And that's when the revolution erupted, the Maidan revolution that really triggered the war, because Russia responded to that by using force to annex Ukrainian land. So I think that was the model initially. And Putin initially was ready to tolerate a Ukrainian state that is independent on paper, but de facto controlled by Moscow. I think now things have changed, and the rhetoric coming out of Moscow is much more, let's say, it's called genocidal. If you listen to what Dmitry Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who is the head of Russia's ruling party, is saying he said it directly in January: no Ukrainian state, no matter how friendly to Russia, will ever be acceptable to us. It's too late for that. We will destroy it, be it done 5 years later, 50 years later. And any Ukrainian, who wishes to live or to have his family live, must understand that the only option to survive physically is to live in a common state with us.
As you say, there's a very strong pro-Western instinct within Ukraine. This is what brought down Yanukovych and keeps Ukrainian integration alive to this day. What are the historical circumstances of that? Where did it come from? Why, going back to my comment earlier about Belarus, why after the breakup of the Soviet Union, didn't Ukraine become a Belarus type, pro-Russian republic?
Dimitri Snyder actually, has a very good analysis of this, and he's
a famous historian,
the famous historian at Yale University, who wrote a book about Lithuania, Belarus, Poland, and Ukraine, and Ukraine was able to maintain its identity and its culture and traditions, even as Russia tried to ban everything in the 19th century and the 18th century, because Ukraine was divided. A chunk of Ukraine was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so even as Russian authorities rounded up and, exiled to Central Asia, the national poet, and banned printing of books in Ukrainian and education in Ukrainian, leading historians and writers could move to Lviv, Lemberg, which was the third largest city of Austria after Vienna and Prague, and publish books there, create a university there, and have a center of culture there. I mean, the same happened in Lithuania. There was a part of Lithuania, now known as Klaipėda, or Membel at the time, under German control. So even though the Russians banned, printing of books in Lithuanian using the Latin script, cultural revival could still proceed in the lands under German rule. Whereas Belarus didn't have that. It was all completely controlled by Russia. And as a result, it became much more assimilated than either Ukraine or Lithuania, or for that matter, Poland.
Yeah, but then, as you say, up until pretty recently, there was this very clear divide between the pro-Russian camp and the pro-Western camp within Ukraine. And then following the invasion of Crimea, was more or less decided in the pro-Western camp.
Yeah, there are several layers of division here. Okay, because there is a linguistic layer, and Central and Western Ukraine are mostly Ukrainian-speaking. Kiev used to be mostly Russian-speaking, and yet politically Kiev was always very pro-Western. In all the elections, in the early years of independence, the pro-Western candidates would get the absolute majority in Kiev. And then you had the industrial south and east, especially Donbass, that was overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. But again, there were divisions in different areas. And, there's were legitimate discussions before, because in 2013, Russia was not an enemy. President Zelensky, grew up Russian-speaking. His famous TV show was in Russian, The Servant of the People. And he, on the morning of January 1st, 2014, as the revolution was already underway in Ukraine on the Maidan, he was hosting the New Year's morning show on the Russian state television. So Russia was sort of a land of higher wages and better opportunities and a less corrupt country than Ukraine at the time. But then Russia invaded, and thousands of Ukrainians died. And then it created these two proxy states in Donetsk and Lugansk in eastern Ukraine that were ruled by gangsters with guns, where properties were taken at gunpoint, where people were executed for showing insufficient loyalty to Russia. People were disappearing and tortured to death. And the majority of the population in those two proxy statelets fled. They voted with their feet, and millions moved to the rest of Ukraine, to Western Europe, or to Russia. And for 8 years, there was this experiment. People in all the other Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine were seeing what it means to live in the Russian world under Russian rule. And nobody in Kharkiv, in Odessa, in Dnipro, in Kherson wanted to be like the people of Donetsk or Lugansk, because every one of these other cities was filled with hundreds of thousands of refugees from Russian rule. And I think that really changed the psychology. And I also remember like people in the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine are not Russian-speaking because they have always been Russian-speaking. They are Russian-speaking because of assimilation, because of bans in Ukrainian language and culture, and their parents or grandparents very likely spoke Ukrainian at home. It's not like some sort of very separate communities that are, have a history of ancient hatred. No, they still identify as Ukrainians.
So this shifting balance is really what contributed to the great mobilization of Ukrainians after the 2022 invasion. This is one thing, but also the fact that the army managed to reinvent itself after, from the ruins of a corrupt and outdated army just less than a decade before, to one that has somewhat successfully fended off a Russian invasion. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I'd like to think of the first phase of the war, 2014 and 15, as an inoculation. So Ukraine was inoculated and had a reaction, and the society reacted by creating all these volunteer units, and people just flocked to help the army. And then the army itself got reconstituted. It was not a fighting force, only at the time. In 2014, only one Ukrainian brigade could be mustered as Russia was annexing Crimea. And even they didn't have batteries in their fighting vehicles. So a professional army was created over time. It was also created by infusing the spirit of these volunteer units. And it was full of people who had combat experience. But I think, we should probably step back a little bit and look at, I think the biggest secret of Ukrainian resilience was the way the Ukrainian idea was reinvented at independence or shortly before. Because, we all know that Ukraine has really dark pages in its history. Ukrainian nationalism in the 1930s was very often toxic, anti-Semitic, complicit with some of the worst war crimes that the Second World War has seen, and was very exclusionary. It was a nationalism of blood and soil, like all the other nationalisms in Europe at the time were. This was the time of, the idea of integral nationalism, the purity, and all the other horrible things that led to so many millions of death. Ukrainian nationalism was reinvented in the 80s and the 90s, very often by Ukrainian dissidents who were sharing their prison experience with Jewish refuseniks like Nathan Sharansky, with the other Russian and Baltic and Central Asian dissidents, came up with a very different idea. And so when Ukraine became independent, the idea was that anybody in Ukraine is a Ukrainian. And it doesn't matter what language you speak, what religion you follow, what blood you have, as long as you are willing to work for the benefit of your country. And that's a very American idea of citizenship and very, very non-European idea of citizenship. And I think this is what allowed Ukraine today, to have a Jewish president and Muslim minister of defense, head of the army who happens to be, originally from Russia. And yet nobody looks at those issues because, the only criteria that matters is, whether you are working for the benefit of the country. And that allowed Ukraine not to fracture when Russia invaded. Along those lines, cleavage lines that it has, it has many churches and two main languages and, complicated history. However, Ukrainians really held together as a society to oppose the external enemy.
Mm-hmm. So this great internal solidarity is something that it really is.
It's an internal solidarity, but that's a result of Ukraine very consciously taking this path in 1991.
Yeah.
Because not every other post-Soviet country did that.
Sure, but it's not the full story, as you say, because much hangs in the balance, and that's thanks to whether Western countries will continue to support Ukraine militarily. I mean, this is really the decisive factor here.
Well, it is a decisive factor, but I think we wouldn't be here now if Ukraine decided to disenfranchise, 20, 30% of this population, like some other post-Soviet countries did.
Mm-hmm. Would we be here now talking about the war in Ukraine or about Ukraine if Trump had been in office in 2022? And by extension, would things, you think, change if he gets re-elected in November this year?
I don't know. It's sort of hard to play, alternative history. What we do know about Trump is that he was the first president who actually authorized lethal military aid to Ukraine. President Obama walked away from Ukraine, famously refused to help in 2015, and actually, in an interview with The Atlantic said there's nothing the U.S. can ever do to prevent Russia from dominating Ukraine. So he washed his hands of Ukraine and said, not my problem. Let me focus on the nuclear deal with Iran instead, where I need Russian cooperation. Former President Trump has had, various issues with Ukraine and was impeached by the House for this famous phone call with President Zelensky. However, the fact is that the first American weapons, the Javelins, arrived in Ukraine on his watch. So what will he do when he's president, if he's president? It's hard to tell. He has a peace plan to achieve peace in 24 hours. And if Russia doesn't accept his plan, he will double aid to Ukraine. That's what he said.
Yeah. But do you think that Putin would have been deterred if the United States or the West in general, whatever president we're talking about, Obama, Trump, or Biden, had played a more firm role in standing up to Ukraine?
Standing up to Russia? I don't know. Obviously, there is the madman theory, international relations, and Trump played it quite well. And I think Russia was really encouraged by the debacle that the American evacuation from Kabul proved to be. And I was in Kabul on August 15th, 2021, and watched how one evening President Ashraf Ghani pledged to fight to the last man, and the next morning he was in a helicopter flying to Abu Dhabi, and the Taliban were in my hotel by lunchtime. And just this show of American humiliation by the Taliban, I think, contributed to the perception that Russia will get away with it. And it was not incorrect, because it's not the Americans who stopped the Russians. The Americans, the U.S., the Biden administration, closed the embassy in Kiev, pulled back all the personnel and said, well, not my problem. Here's a box of javelins. Have an insurgency. We'll help you like we helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, in the 1980s. But really not much else we can do. And the U.S., just like Russia, was expecting a collapse of Kyiv in a matter of days. The U.S. really got involved only after the Ukrainians stopped the Russians around Kyiv, using mostly Ukrainian weapons, Soviet vintage weapons, and defeated the elite formations of the Russian military in March 2022. American heavy weapons only started arriving in July this year.
So what contributed to that, you think, was really this resilience of the Ukrainian nation as a nation? So many people willing to fight and die for the country is really...
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, nobody helps people who don't help themselves.
Yeah, sure.
And the expectation was that the Ukrainians will not help themselves. And they did. And they surprised, I think, not just the Russians and the Americans and the Europeans, but also themselves, because nobody could quite know how things will turn out.
Really is Russia's, Putin's miscalculation that you talked about can also be seen in a broader view about, America's influence receding. You mentioned Afghanistan, of course, but also, taking a longer view, it's the invasion of Georgia in 2008 that, left Russia almost unscathed. And as you said, Obama siding up to Putin to secure the Iran deal, and also many other geopolitical issues that maybe placed America's role in a different light. And we can tie that, and I'd like you to comment on this. A similar thing was attributed to Hamas invasion of Israel in October 2023, seeing that just like maybe something that was attributed to Ukraine, Israel was not as cohesive as a society as it had been before, brutally internally divided by all sorts of domestic reforms, etc. And also the ties with America not being as strong as they had been before. Do you see like a similar sort of geopolitical development that's characterizing both episodes, both fronts?
Well, I think the two conflicts are very, very different. But, it is true that, autocratic powers, have a hard time understanding the strength of democracies, and B, do believe that the American influence is waning, and that the age of America being willing to engage around the world is coming to an end, in part because they see, very isolationist forces, especially in the Republican Party, on the rise, but also, sometimes shocking lack of competence coming from the White House.
Mm-hmm. What do you think lies ahead? Is this like war of attrition gonna continue open-endedly?
In Ukraine.
Yeah. I wouldn't ask you to comment on Hamas and Israel, even though it is also a war of attrition to an extent.
I think, well, we are now in the attrition phase. And in this attrition phase, attrition always ends in something. There was attrition in World War I, that then front lines didn't move, and then all of a sudden they moved very quickly. And, the German armies were in Kiev in 1918. Attrition, as long as Western aid continues, actually favors the Ukrainians. Because what we're seeing now is that, Ukraine is destroying more Russian tank howitzers, fighting vehicles, and other pieces of equipment every month than Russia is able to manufacture or refurbish or get otherwise. Russia doesn't have, an allied power that can send it another fleet. So in a year or two, Russia will be down to levels that are unsustainable for pursuing the war. But Ukraine has to get there. And to get there, it needs ammunition. And the Europeans are ramping up production, but they will only have enough ammunition to supply the Ukrainian military probably by early next year, according to analysts. So this American stockpile that is not being used now because of, because the U.S. Congress has not approved the supplemental bill, that's a critical short-term vulnerability for the Ukrainian military. And that's why it's losing ground now, because it went from having parity in ammunition to having, 5-1 or 10-1 disadvantage. Also because the Russians got, a million shells from North Korea.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think that will affect this psychological resilience that we were talking about? Even if they do muddle through that difficult period, do you think that, Ukraine as a society would be able to still stand up and fight?
Well, it's an existential fight, right? So, people have seen what happens when the Russians arrive. Not just in Bucha around Kiev, where in a matter of weeks, hundreds were, tortured to death, shot in the streets, eyes gouged, whatever. And, but also, in the cities that the Russians take, the cities of Bakhmut that was taken last year, or Avdiivka was taken this year, and nothing but, an expanse of flattened buildings. Nobody lives there anymore. So if your choice is to keep fighting or be annihilated, it's better to keep fighting. And I think it's not like there is some other option on the table. It's not like there's a peace plan to which you can sign up to. I mean, the Russian peace plan is total control.
Yeah. The Israeli response to the war in Ukraine was heavily debated in Israel, but also outside. The cold shoulder that Netanyahu turned to Zelensky and the Ukrainians in favor of some sort of maintaining a relationship with Putin. And also when Netanyahu wasn't in office, when Naftali Bennett, the short-lived PM, was in office, he, of course, famously flew on Shabbat to Moscow to sort of try and negotiate some sort of a settlement. How is that seen, if at all, in Ukraine? Do people even consider Israel as some sort of force to be reckoned with?
I think people are shocked in Ukraine, were shocked in the beginning. And, people very much follow things in Israel for a simple reason, that I think anybody in Kiev or Odessa or any other big city has either a relative, a cousin, an uncle, a school friend, some sort of relation living in Israel. Because, there was so much intermarriage, so much mixing that, there's hardly anyone in Kiev who doesn't have some kind of personal connection. And, they were just, expecting more understanding. As far as Netanyahu is concerned, if you remember in 2018, when, I think it was 2018, when he went to Moscow for the May 9th parade with Putin and the Serbian president, Vučić, he even wore the St. George ribbon, which has really become, since 2014, the symbol of, Russian irredentist claims on Ukraine and other areas. Vučić didn't wear it. So I think that didn't pass unnoticed even then in Ukraine. I mean, I guess it's little to say about that, really.
Okay. And I mean, of course, Zelensky's Jewishness is famous and well known. Of course, is one of his, I wouldn't say trademarks, but it is some sort of a. Do you think that people expected that to play in Ukraine's favor vis-a-vis Israel, maybe America? I mean, was it even debated in Ukraine?
No, it's not like Zelensky was wearing his, Jewish origin on his sleeve, during the campaign. He was campaigning as a Ukrainian, which he is. I think, as I said, because there is so much intermarriage in Ukraine and, everyone is a little bit Jewish in the big cities, it doesn't really matter that much, I think.
It's interesting because here in Israel, Zelensky is seen as the Jewish president. And
well, he had a Jewish prime minister from the previous government as when he took office. It's not that unusual.
Yeah.
He had a Jewish minister of defense, and then there is a Muslim one now.
Yeah. No, it's quite incredible. So, do you think that really the Ukrainians were pleasantly surprised by how they held on, and was there initially some sort of like a doom and gloom mood that changed radically into this great hope, and now it's somewhat plateaued with this war of attrition that's been going on?
Well, there were plenty of mood swings, but I think in the first reaction was disbelief, and I was kind of prepared for this because I've seen this happen elsewhere, and I've seen how easily kind of you go from peace to war and everything changes, and your entire reality just collapses. But people in Kiev have never seen that, so for them it was unimaginable that this would happen. And then it happened. And initially, streets were empty. Nobody knew how things will shake out. And I think everybody rushed to take their families out of harm's way. So, basically men would take their spouses, their children, their mothers, and drive them to Western Ukraine. And then a lot of them would come back to fight. And the city was empty. And, it was touch and go. But
how long was it for?
Well, there was a kind of, I'd say the first 48 hours, it was really fluid. Because nobody knew how...
People thought Kiev would be taken within days.
Yeah, well, and, the government hadn't quite organized itself yet. Nobody knew what would be the level of treason, because everybody was expecting large parts of the army and the government apparatus to maybe switch sides because the Russian intelligence services had, spent a lot of money and a lot of time cultivating this, sleeper agents and assets. That didn't happen. And then on the evening of the second day of the war, Zelensky made his famous appearance in front of the presidential palace with his top officials saying, "We are here and we're not going anywhere." At the time, the Russian television was reporting he's already fled to Poland, and Boris Johnson was calling him and telling him to set up a government in exile in London, like Poland had done in 1939. And so the fact that he just sort of stayed and made this stand, I think, galvanized a lot of people. And I remember driving through Kiev the next morning, seeing hundreds of men and women coming out of their buildings and to a recruitment center to pick up guns and go to the front line. And so this gloom and doom kind of turned into more and more faith in victory as the engagements were successful and the Russians were stopped, and then the Russians were defeated around Kiev. And so the ability to defeat the Russians, to force them to withdraw from the north of Ukraine by the end of March, so after a month of fighting, was really a catalyst. Then the big bloody war in Donbass started, and Ukraine was out of ammo. And so Ukraine was losing, 300-400 soldiers a day in those days in sort of June, July 2022. And those were desperate hours, and Russia regrouped and started to use much more professional tactics. And that's when Western weapons finally appeared in the battlefield. And they helped Ukraine to stabilize the front line and stop losing land. And, by then, Russia was out of men because Putin was refusing to mobilize reservists because doing so would have meant he acknowledged that his quote-unquote special military operation was not going to plan. And so in September, there were only about 100,000 Russian combat troops in Ukraine. Ukraine had a massive manpower advantage, which it exploited. So there was a spirit of hope and the miracle in Kharkiv, and Ukraine was advancing. And then the Russians mobilized, and the Western weapons were slow in coming, and then they stabilized the front lines. And then we've been in this sort of stalemate of attrition ever since.
Mm-hmm. And how does that affect the mood in Ukraine, and also not just the mood, also like economic activity? Are things going more or less normally in Ukraine outside of the battlefields?
Yeah, so people are trying to leave, to live normal lives insofar as it's possible. Some cities it's more difficult, like Kharkiv, because it's really close to the Russian border and gets attacked almost every day. So, high schools have classes in the subway, and the university didn't reopen because it was struck by missiles when it tried. In Kiev, it's pretty much back to normal. There is a curfew, but it's a midnight, 5 a.m. curfew. So, restaurants, close at 10:30 p.m. It's probably later than close in London sometimes.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people from Kiev who fled to the West came back to work, and the city is full of people who fled from the East, from the cities that no longer exist, like, Popasna or Lysychansk or Bakhmut.
Yeah. Are you hopeful? Do you think Ukraine will hold up? Yeah.
I mean, it will hold up. The question is at what price? And how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians will have to die, before the war ends. But it's going to be really hard for Russia to conquer Ukraine. I mean, they could gain some more land, they could gain another city or two, but I think extinguishing Ukraine as a country is no longer something within Russia's abilities.
And now it remains for Putin to acknowledge that, which is also a big hurdle.
Well, yeah, it's hard for him to acknowledge this because for him, politically, it's much easier to continue the war and continue the killing, saying the victory is around the corner, than to acknowledge defeat, because continuing existence of Ukraine as an independent country would be defeat of his initial war plan.
All right, Yaroslav Trofimov, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please write us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.